Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. What we're going to do is we are going to drop the transmission pan and we're going to replace the transmission filter. The vehicle that we're working on is a third generation Toyota 4Runner. The filter underneath those pans is not like a typical paper filter that you have to change at a regular interval, like every 30,000 miles, like a lot of the older American Motors cars where you have to drop the pan every time you want to get to the filter. These filters are a fine mesh metal filter. The fine mesh filter in the transmission filter is very much like the fine mesh filter in the power steering reservoir. It collects any fine particles and keeps them there. Some people think that the transmission filter is a kind of a thing that you never really have to worry about because it is a metal filter. It's not necessarily a paper filter that has to be changed. However, if you don't know the history of your vehicle and you're wondering if they actually abused the transmission, didn't change the transmission fluid on a regular basis, maybe there were at times heavy deposits in the oil and those deposits collected in the filter now are clogging the filter and partially blocking the fluid flow to your transmission. My vehicle, I think, was pretty well taken care of. The previous owners had pretty good records. And I'm assuming that when I get the oil filter out, I'm going to see that the fine mesh filter screen is not going to be clogged up at all. That's what I think I'm going to see. I'm going to take this one step further, and what I'm going to do with my old filters, I'm going to take a Dremel tool and I'm going to cut it out, because some people say, yeah, you don't need to replace the filter if it's dirty. You could just spray some carb cleaner or brake cleaner in there and shake it out and you're good to go. Here's the problem that I see with that technique. If you genuinely think that the filter is partially clogged up, there's filter material throughout the whole area of this filter. Let me show you what it looks like. It's a pretty big filter. This side faces downward into the fluid, and then this side with the cork gaskets goes up against the valve body. And when you look inside here, you can see the fine mesh filter screen, and then when you flip it over and you look at the port over here, you can see filter screen in here also. I pretty much think that there's filter material throughout most of this area. What I learned when trying to clean out the fine mesh filter screen in the power steering reservoir, I had to get direct spraying on the filter screen to really get the black gunk out of the filter, and it took several applications over and over and over again. When people say that they're effectively cleaning out this filter screen, I don't necessarily think they're getting it as clean as they think they would, because if you spray it in here, then shake it up, and if there's truly some trapped gunk in the filter in this area, well, I don't think it's going to really get it clean. I think if you do see deposits in this filter screen and you think that it's dirty, I would recommend you replace your filter instead of just trying to clean it out. We'll see later in the video with me cutting the sucker out and to see how much filter screen is actually between these two ports, this one and this one. To get ready for this job, I have the front of my truck jacked up, and it's supported on jack stands on opposing frame rails on the driver and passenger side, so it gives me some room to work. My skid plates are out of the way. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drain the transmission fluid into a food grade container so I can measure how much I'm draining out. So this way it's easier for me to figure out how much to add back in. An extra step that I'm going to do that is not necessarily required, but I feel that getting the front sway bar out of the way is going to make it easier for me to get the pan dropped down and to get the pan back up in position. The factory service manual doesn't say anything about removing the sway bar, but I'm going to do it anyways just to make it a little bit easier for me to get the pan out from underneath the transmission and back in place. Alright, so we're going to get underneath the rig and we're going to start draining the transmission fluid into the food grade container. On my drain pan bolt for the transmission, it's a 14 millimeter, so I'm just going to break it loose and then take it off with my hand. If it was tightened to spec, it shouldn't be that tight. So here's what I'm talking about with the sway bar. It looks like there's enough room to bring the pan in above the sway bar and then into place, but I just rather get this sucker out of the way so I can just drop the pan straight down instead of having to bring it out at an angle. We're not going to show the removal of the sway bar because we do show it in another video, our steering rack bushing replacement and sway bar bushing replacement video. So you could click on the link above if you need to know how to do that. But it's really simple. You disconnect the end links on both sides. Then you just got a bolt and a nut on both sides for the sway bar brackets, and then this sucker drops out. We're gonna get the sway bar out first, and then the next thing we're gonna do before actually removing the bolts that hold the pan to the transmission, we're gonna get the upper part of the dipstick tube removed, because I don't want anything fighting me when it's time to drop this pan. The upper dipstick tube is just one other thing that could possibly fight you on the way out and with the pan going back in. So I'm gonna remove that also before attacking the actual pan bolts. The first step you wanna do to get your upper part of your transmission dipstick off the engine is just take out your dipstick. The dipstick tube is affixed to the head with a 12mm bolt, and it's right underneath here, and it's kind of hard to see, but we're going to get underneath next and show you where that bolt is. But if you're looking from the top, it's right underneath this bracket. This is the 12mm bolt we're talking about. We're taking this shot from the wheel well on the passenger side. So I'm using one kind of medium length extension and then one longer extension so I can get into here comfortably and use my Milwaukee cordless ratchet. Okay, it's loose, and now I'm just going to zip it out with the Milwaukee. Here's the 12mm bolt I just removed to free the upper part of the dipstick tube from the head. And then now you just pull up, and there's an O-ring that makes a seal with the bottom part of the dipstick tube. Just pull up and out. And here's the rubber O-ring that I was talking about. Just make sure that that's still there and it's intact. It's not cracked or ripped. Now that we have the upper part of the dipstick tube disconnected, we're ready to start taking all the bolts out that hold the pan to the transmission. There's 19 10mm bolts. You can start removing these bolts and nothing's really going to happen because the factory used a sealant. They used a form-in-place gasket, and so you actually have to take a tool, and I'm going to show you that tool in a little bit, to actually separate the pan from the transmission, and that's when the pan's going to start coming down. So you can remove all these bolts and nothing's really going to happen because it's still sealed against the transmission. I have just a medium length 3/8 extension, a 10mm, and I'm using my Milwaukee cordless M12 tool to zip them out. Here's the pan separation tool that I bought. I actually bought it on eBay, and I'll put a link in the video description if you'd like to buy the same one. You see it has this nice little knife edge that's beveled out so you can get it slipped in between the pan and the body of the transmission, get a purchase point, and then it has all these different striking surfaces. It's pretty heavy duty when you have it in your hands. You can strike it, drive it in, and then if you want to work either forward or backwards, you can strike it on the sides too to slowly break the bond of the gasket from the pan and from the transmission. And then it also has this little handle, so you can slip this little handle in here like this, and so you can hold it while you're doing that. The hardest part about using this tool is just finding a place on the transmission pan where you can get in there and be able to strike it with the hammer to get it started, then slowly start working it around the circumference of the pan to free the bond of the gasket material from the pan. In order to have an easier time to strike the gasket separator tool, this plastic cover on the 3rd generation Toyota 4Runners goes right below where the fuel filter is. So I'm just going to get this out of my way so I'll have a little bit easier time with the tool. They're all 12mm bolts. So we're on the driver's side. It seems to be the best side to start the attack of the removal of the transmission pan, because on the other side you have the fluid lines in your way, you have the exhaust in your way. On this side, all you have is the front drive shaft. So I'm gonna keep the tool in the orientation with the handle facing up, And I'm just gonna get the knife edge lined up between the pan and the body of the transmission, and I'm gonna tap with just a regular claw hammer. And I'm seeing a little bit of separation right now. So once you have the tool driven in pretty far, basically maybe like a ½ an inch, you got it driven in. Then you could hit it forward or backwards, and you have the striking surfaces on the side. So I just tap it. Right now I'm tapping it towards the engine, and I'm breaking the bond as I go. You just keep on tapping all the way down that side. So now I pretty much have the bond of the sealant broken free on this driver's side. So now that this side is free, we determined that we're probably just going to start pulling with our hands instead of trying to get the tool on the back side, the front side, and the passenger side, because there's really nowhere to really strike the tool to drive it in. Flex it a little bit. Here, it's finally coming loose. I'm gonna set this down. Look at all that oil still left in there. It's not necessarily that the oil pan draining didn't do a lot more than you think it would. Because we drained it quite a while ago, the transmission will keep on draining fluid out at a very slow rate, and you can actually get more than just like about 4.5 quarts out if you actually sit there and let it drain for longer. You're seeing some residual in the pan, but you're also seeing the fact that I put the drain plug back in so I can get the drain container out of my way while I was working underneath there, and over time it just slowly filled up the pan a little bit more. So that's what you're seeing. So now we've got about 6 quarts out of the system, first by draining it, and then by letting it sit for a little bit, and then draining what's left in the pan. So now let's take a closer look at the pan itself and the magnets and how much metal debris is accumulated on the bottom. There's 4 magnets, 1, 2, 3, 4. The factory service manual says that if they're attached to the magnet, that's magnetic material, obviously, and it's possibly bearing, gear, and clutch plate wear of your transmission. If it's non-magnetic, it's just debris in the bottom of the pan not attached to the magnet, that's from bushing wear. And what I'm seeing is really actually pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with what I'm seeing. If I pick up a magnet, there's a light amount of sludge on there, but not a whole lot. It's just a very little bit of gunk attached to the magnet. I'll pick up another one, and you can see a light amount of magnetic material. So I would have to say an analysis just by looking at the magnets, I think the health of my transmission is pretty darn good. And so I'm pretty happy with that. The next step we're going to do is we're going to remove the filter off the valve body, and then we're gonna take an analysis of that, take a look at the screen material, see if we see any buildup of gunk on the fine mesh metal screen, and then we're actually gonna cut that sucker open with the Dremel tool and be able to get a better look at all the filter material inside that filter. All right, the transmission fluid filter on this 3rd gen 4Runner has 10mm bolts holding it to the valve body. There's one here, one here, one here, and one here. It's kind of interesting. There's a difference. These are a gold color or yellow color, and these are black. So there's probably a reason why Toyota did that. I'm thinking maybe they might be different links. So I'm going to pay attention to that. So again, I'm just going to use my Milwaukee and zip these out. It's a very light torque spec for these, so they shouldn't be tight. And I shouldn't have done that. You see what just happened? The filter moved a little bit, it broke the seal of the cork gasket, and that allowed more fluid to drain out of the valve body. So that was interesting. So now I'm going to hold this with one hand. Direct it in there. There's more fluid left in here. Just going to rotate this thing around to try to get more of the fluid out. Now you could see all the ports that make a seal with that filter. You got one here, you got one here, and one here. And here's the difference. This is the reason why that Toyota made them a different color, because the gold ones are shorter than the black ones. So the gold ones go on the front and the black ones go over on this side, and the shorter ones go up front. Okay, we have the filter on the workbench. I noticed that it has like a lot of like black buildup on the filter, so I'm just going to wipe this off a little bit before I start cutting. Looking into the ports, I can see blockage on this port that faces the valve body. On the side that actually is sucking from the pan, I don't see much debris at all. The filter screen seems to be closer to this side rather than this side, so I'm going to take the Dremel tool and I'm going to cut along this whole outer edge and pull this off, and so we can see better all the filter material. So I just got my Dremel tool with a metal cutting blade. We're not really going to actually show you this, but I'm just basically letting you know how I'm doing it. If you wanted to do the same thing to really examine how much blockage is in here, I'm going to cut it and then we're going to show you what the filter looks like with one side lifted off. I've got this thing cut off, but I just kind of realized maybe some of the debris that we're going to see in there now is debris from cutting the actual filter apart, but hopefully most of it went outward. Here's a look at how much filter screen, and this is kind of what I wanted to show, is that if you think that you can successfully clean this thing out by shooting it in this port and then shooting it in this port or maybe one of these other ones and then shaking it up and dumping it out multiple times, you might get it fairly clean that way. But then again, maybe if there's some material really buried into this fine mesh filter screen, maybe you're not going to be that successful. Unfortunately, I don't know how much of this stuff is actually from my transmission or is it debris that I just shot in here from cutting this off. But you can see some sludge buildup in the corners here, which lets me believe that this filter screen is filtering out a fair amount of particulate matter from the transmission and doing a fairly good job. I wouldn't suggest somebody to try clean this filter out. I would suggest you just replace it, because I don't know if the indirect application of the brake cleaner or carb cleaner is really going to get this as clean as you would hope. So I would just replace it. It is a little pricey, maybe about 40 bucks, but I think it's money well spent. Now what I'm doing is I'm just cleaning up the magnets, and then I'm going to wipe out the pan really good. And then after I get the pan really clean and the magnets clean, then you have to handle the most tedious part of this job, and that's getting all the old sealant off the pan and off the transmission. And that's just going to take some time and some patience to get it nice and clean for either a fresh application of form-in-place gasket from Toyota, or you use a cork gasket. So with the scraping of the gasket material, choose your tool of choice. I bought this little plastic razor blade setup to where I could scrape along surfaces, not be worried about gouging the metal. You could also use a regular razor blade with a holder. If that's all you have, that's what you use. Just be really careful not to really dig the blade in and really scrape a deep groove into the metal, either on the pan or on the transmission. So I'm going to slowly work this and just get it clean as best I can with the plastic one. If I have some stubborn material, then I'll probably use a regular metal razor blade. Instead of using the plastic scraper, it worked good to get the thicker stuff off, but now the stuff that's really attached to the pan is kind of harder to get off. So I have these two Dremel attachments. They're like little mini wire wheels. One is more like a, kind of looks like a brush attachment for like a vacuum, and then this is like a little mini wheel. So we're finding that this is working much faster to get the gasket material off the pans. We're going to use these two to get the pan nice and clean for the application of the new sealant. So you can see that this wire wheel on the Dremel did a really nice job of getting all the old gasket material off. Now I'm just going to take some brake clean and I'm just going to spray it everywhere and clean up the pan really good. The next thing I'm going to do is attack the sealant on the transmission. I'm not going to want to use this because this thing is going to sling all this old gasket material all over my valve body, and I really don't want that. I'm going to have to do it the old-fashioned way, just scrape it as best I can and then clean it up with some brake cleaner after that on a rag. Just clean up the surface really good. I would be mindful of this dipstick tube. If you get any debris in there, I'm going to actually blow some compressed air through this side, so if any gasket material got dropped into there, I'm going to blow it out this end right here. So here's the progression of tools. I first used the plastic razor blade tool. Then I actually used a Craftsman gasket scraper. It's got a nice fine knife edge, and I scraped along to get more of the material off. The final tool I'm going to use is some fine steel wool, and I've already tried a sample, and if I rub it on here with a little bit of elbow grease, you can see that it cleaned it off really nice. So I'm just going to continue with the steel wool around the whole border. I'm going to get it nice and clean, and then we'll be ready to put the new filter on. Just like on the transmission pan, I'm going to put a little bit of brake cleaner on a rag, and then I'm just going to wipe all the sealing surfaces for the pan. Get it nice and clean. Just do that around all sides. So I made a wrong assumption. The two black bolts for the filter, they are actually slightly different lengths. There's one that's probably about 1/8 of an inch longer than the other one, maybe as much as 1/4. And so when you look at the two spots where those bolts are going to go in, this one has to travel a little further than this one. I'm just going to use logic and say that the longer one's going to go over here and the shorter one here. There's no mistaking the other two front ones because those are both the same length. We can't mess those up. The two gold ones are both the same length, so we can't mess those up. So moral of the story, when you're taking them out, note the orientation because it is technically a guess, but I don't think it's going to be a big deal. I'm going to put the longer bolt here and the shorter one of the black ones there. So this is the orientation. You see the 3 cork gaskets that are going to meet up with these 3 ports. Okay, that one started. We'll get one of the ones started in the front. That one started. Get this one going. Then I'll get this last one in. Okay, all of them are started. So I'm just using a shorty little 3/8 ratchet, and I'm just going to slowly bring these things up tight. So I'm just going to get them all just barely touching the bottom of the valve body. Just nice, just barely tight. Now I'm going to transition to my inch-pound torque wrench. The torque spec for these 4 filter bolts is 88 inch-pounds. So I'm just going to give them a little bit of a turn, each one, and slowly bring them up to the spec. All the bolts are fairly snugged up, and now on this pass, I'm just going to go one more little tiny turn. That one actually hit the torque spec. That one not yet. Not yet. That's at the torque spec. That's at the torque spec. Just going to go around one more time, make sure that they're all good. Okay, the filter's on and torque to the proper spec. I'm choosing to go the old school route, so I'm going to use the Toyota form in place gasket, and it says to put about a 2 to 3 millimeter bead along the pan, and when you get to the holes for the bolts, you go on the inside. When you have this pan in your hand, you'll see that there's a raised section right in the middle, then it kind of steps off like barely anything, not even a millimeter. So we want to put the bead on the raised center, go around the holes on the inside, and then just do it all the way around. The key is that they say when you do this, you want to assemble it within 10 minutes. Take your time and be careful, but not so much time where it takes you forever. So I used the little metal tube of toothpaste thing to squeeze it out, but it must have cracked it. It made it harder for me because as it was squeezing out the plastic tip end, it was squeezing out the backside too, so I got it all over my hands. But you can see I've got a decent bead all the way around, and it's a little sloppy in spots because I had to rest my hands because I had to squeeze this thing so hard. So you go around the holes on the inside, and then now I'm going to get this pan up against the transmission. Don't forget to put your magnets back into the bottom of the pan. There we go. So now I'm going to get the transmission pan in place, and be careful not to mess up the gasket material, which is maybe easier said than done. So I currently have two hands on it. I'm able to look to see that the holes are lining up, and I'm going to press it up against the transmission. Now, holding it with one hand, I'm going to get one of the bolts started. I'm going to get one started on the front side. Now that I have two opposing bolts holding it, now I can just work on getting all the other bolts. I don't have to worry about holding it. I have all 19 bolts started. Now I'm just, again, using a little shorty 3/8 ratchet, long extension, 10 millimeter, and I'm just gonna slowly bring these up snug. I'm not gonna tighten anything to spec yet. So I'm just gonna go around and get it to where they're just kind of barely touching down. They're not really tight. I noticed a very big mistake in the factory service manual. The factory service manual said the torque spec for these small 10 millimeter bolts for the transmission oil pan are 65 foot-pounds, and it's actually 65 inch-pounds. This is a situation where you can't just blindly follow the factory service manual. You have to use some common sense, and common sense would speak that a small little 10 millimeter bolt is not supposed to be torqued to 65 foot-pounds. So we're going to torque these to 65 inch-pounds. All the bolts are cinched up snug now, and I'm going to just do kind of a crossing pattern and slowly bring it up to the spec. That's actually already at the spec right there. It's really light. I think I hit them all, but now I'm just going to go around those two. All right. That one wasn't quite there. Okay. They should be all now torqued to 65 inch-pounds. So now we're going to get our drain pan bolt in. Don't forget to use a fresh crush washer, and the crush washer has like a flat side, then kind of a rounded side. The rounded side is the side that crushes. Have that facing the pan. And we'll torque this to spec. The spec is 15 foot-pounds. I'm going to use my inch-pound torque wrench, so 15 foot-pounds is equal to 180 inch-pounds. What I found on this torque wrench, maybe at the higher levels, maybe it's not as accurate, but I've kind of got it to the point of tightness where I think it's good enough, and I haven't hit the torque spec yet, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go by feel and not by the torque spec, so this is tight enough now. Now I'm ready to get the upper part of the dipstick tube back in. I'm going to lubricate this O-ring with a little bit of transmission fluid. So I just got my fluid of choice, which is a Valvoline Dex Merc. I'm going to dip my finger in there and just lubricate it really good. So now you just go down along your valve cover, along the exhaust, and you can actually see pretty good if you have decent enough lighting, if it's not dark out, and you can get it met up with the bottom part of the transmission tube. Now that I know I got it started in there, I'm going to go below and pull it into place. The upper part of the dipstick tube is already partially inserted. I'm just going to reach up and pull it all the way down, and you'll know when it's fully seated because there's no gap anymore and you can't pull it any further. So now we'll go back to the driver's side wheel well and we'll get that bolt started to hold the upper part of the dipstick tube to the head. Just like we used to get the bolt out, we're going to use again the 2 long extensions, and now I'm just going to go in from the wheel well, and it's going to be hard for you to see, but I could see it, and I'm going to line up the bolt, get it started, and then tighten it up. All right. Now I could look up a torque spec for this, but I'm not going to bother with the torque spec for this upper dipstick tube holder because all it is holding the dipstick. It's not that crucial. So just cinch it down nice and tight. I'm using very little leverage with this shorty 3/8 ratchet, snugging up, and I'm calling that good. To reiterate why it's kind of nice to have this 18-quart food grade container is I've got most of the transmission fluid that left the transmission in this container. Some of it dripped on the ground after we pulled the filter out, but the majority of it we captured in here. And this is right at 6 quarts. So now I know that I could just go ahead and immediately add 6 quarts of transmission fluid, and I'm going to be pretty darn close to having the exact amount that I had before I started this procedure. So use the right funnel for the job. This is what I call a transmission funnel. It could be used for other applications, but it has this nice narrow end and a pretty big pouring area to where less chance of making a mess. So you stick this into your dipstick tube because this is how you fill your automatic transmission. You fill it via the dipstick tube. Now I'm going to add 6 quarts of transmission fluid to the transmission. If you're like me and you're doing this on a 3rd generation Toyota 4Runner, you have to use a fluid that's compatible with Dextron 3. So I've chosen to use a Valvoline Dex Merc, and it says right on there for vehicles requiring Dextron 3 or Mercon. Some people choose to use synthetic fluids. I'm just kind of old school and I'm using a regular conventional transmission fluid. But if you like to go synthetic, then use your fluid of choice. The instructions from the form in place gasket that I used from Toyota, it's seal packing 1281. It's meant for transmissions and differentials. The instructions say that the engine may be started in 1 to 2 hours. So I put the fluid in there, but I'm not going to run it just yet. So I'm going to let the vehicle sit for at least 2 hours, and then I'm going to take it on a test drive and get the transmission up to operating temperature. Depending on your vehicle, you'll have to look at the specs of what operating temperature is for your vehicle. On the 3rd generation Toyota 4Runner, it's a temperature range between 158 and 176. If you have a way to monitor your temperatures through some type of OBD2 reader to a phone app like Torque Pro, or you have a scan gauge, that would be ideal. But if you don't have something like that, go for a really good drive along the freeway. Go at least about 5 miles out. Do a couple hard accelerations to where you get the transmission to kick down a few times. Come back to your house, immediately pop the hood and check the level. And you're gonna wanna see that the level is in the hot range. One thing that's interesting about transmission fluid is it will continue to expand as it gets hotter. So say you climbed a big long mountain and you got it up to like 220 degrees. Well, now you're going to see that fluid level over the top of the hot mark because it's gotten so hot, because it continues to expand as it gets hotter. So just check it when you think it's right about normal operating temperature, and just make sure it's somewhere in the hot range. Knowing that the transmission filter underneath the transmission oil pan is just a fine mesh metal filter, I decided a while back that I would add an additional filter to the system. This is a magnifying type of filter. This one actually right now isn't made by Magnifying, but the original one I bought was. I couldn't find Magnifying anymore, so I'll put a link to the ones that I bought currently off of Amazon. And this is just the return line nipple on the bottom of the radiator. This is the transmission cooler, so this is the return line hose right here, and I put it in at this point, and then this goes to the external transmission cooler that I have a video for. If you click on the link above, you'll see that video. This is something optional that I would suggest doing to give your transmission system a little bit of extra filtration. It's up to you whether you do this or not. This is optional. All right, we're done with this job. We showed you how to change your transmission filter underneath the pan of your transmission. Not all transmissions are going to be the same, but we basically showed you the proper steps to doing this job. Drain the fluid out, disconnect the transmission dipstick tube, get anything else out of the way that you think is going to fight you, like the front sway bar. Take all the bolts off of the transmission pan, break it free with some type of special tool or whatever you have available. You get the pan down, you clean everything up, you get your new filter in place, get sealant or a cork gasket, you get everything reaffixed, you torque it to spec, and you're good to go after you refill your transmission with some fresh transmission fluid. We thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We'll be back with more videos. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Take care. Bye-bye.